It is Friday, and we are working for Crusoe. Friday, May 24th, 2024, in Los Angeles. He is Sam Park. In San Diego, I am John Ramey. The UAW's win streak has been snapped. President of Iran is killed in a helicopter crash. And Sam and I will compare the World Wars and the Cold Wars, plural. Let's start with the United Auto Workers. Sam Park, Axios reporting the United Auto Workers winning streak ended late Friday, that is last Friday, when a majority of workers at a Mercedes manufacturing campus in Alabama voted against unionizing. The defeat follows a string of victories for the UAW that included the big three concurrent strike from last year, and then also the April vote by Volkswagen workers in Chattanooga, Tennessee to join the union. So now there is rampant speculation that the Chattanooga vote was maybe a fluke in the otherwise more anti-union South. The president of the union, Shawn Fain, said, quote, "This is a David and Goliath fight. Sometimes Goliath wins a battle, but David wins the war." End of quote. Not the most literal interpretation of the David and Goliath story, but point taken, President Fain. Your thoughts, Sam?
Well, for one thing, the successful vote in Memphis, that is for the Volkswagen workers to join the UAW, was the third vote that they'd taken over the past number of years to try and do so. And of course, the first two votes failed, obviously. And so, in contrast, the vote in Alabama for the Mercedes workers was the first time they tried to unionize those workers. And so there's a number of factors in play here. The last failed vote at Volkswagen was very close, whereas the successful vote at Volkswagen this year, just a few weeks ago, was, as we recall, nearly 3-1 in favor of joining the UAW. Meanwhile, the failed vote last week at Mercedes, 45% of the workers still voted to join the union. So it wasn't a blowout in the sense that the vote at Volkswagen to join the union was. And so to get up to 45% on their first try is not terrible in a notoriously anti-union southern states such as Alabama. They will try again. And the contracts that they have with the big three don't expire for almost another 4 years. In fact, 3 years and 11 months. So they've got time to work on Mercedes. And so it's difficult for me to think of a 3-1 vote in favor of joining the union as a fluke, right? If someone's characterizing it that way, I think that is a mischaracterization. But it's true.
It was presented as more of a rhetorical question than an analysis.
Okay, fine. But the point is that, as you said, the UAW, they were sort of due for a loss, right? I mean, and I think Shawn Fain and the rest of the UAW leadership know perfectly well that they've got an uphill fight. It's not going to be easy. I couldn't help but notice that the first two foreign manufacturers that they attempted to unionize were German, that is European. And that they seem to be keeping their powder dry for the Asian automakers, partly, I think, because, for instance, Japanese corporations just in general are said to have a very distinctive sort of business culture that's very different from American business culture and European business culture, which are more similar to one another. That's merely a conjecture on my part, however.
Axios also pointed out that Mercedes waged kind of aggressive anti-union messaging, whereas Volkswagen's kind of stayed out of the way leading up to that vote. So Axios cited an NPR report about videos warning about union failures and how dues are spent, holding small group meetings with employees, urging them to vote no.
Yes.
They also made some moves to appease workers, according to Axios, replacing a top executive who wasn't liked, and they did eliminate a two-tier wage system. So there were some maybe concessions to labor in an attempt to maybe soften labor's, thirst for unionization.
That's right. But the more sort of aggressive tactics, like, having videos on endless loop in the break room, I mean, that's a pretty standard
Yep.
practice in companies of this kind in the South, which I find pretty obnoxious, right? It's bad, I mean, you're on break from work, you have to watch this crap on TV, I mean, it's just seems to be uh, not just aggressive, but kind of rude, frankly.
I mean, I was at a job once that expanded the Writers Guild to a position I held. And I remember having a meeting with management saying, "Are you sure you want to, not nothing nefarious, but just kind of like, you're wasting my time with, like, I know what I earn now. Anything's
Yeah.
better than this,
What's it to you, pal? I
Yeah,
mean,
yeah.
yeah, I don't understand things like this. But then
Yeah.
again,
But we're not
I'm
management material, maybe.
no, certainly, apparently not.
Any other thoughts about the UAW? As you
No,
say,
I mean,
they will vote again.
yeah, there will be more for this story. I'm sure they'll attempt to unionize other plants in different places as time goes on. So we'll be hearing more from the UAW in the future. I'm confident.
Okay, reporting from the Associated Press, Iranian President Ibrahim Raisi and the country's foreign minister were found dead Monday, hours after their helicopter crashed in fog. It left the Islamic Republic without two key leaders as extraordinary tensions gripped the wider Middle East. The supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, who has the final say in the Shiite theocracy. Again, this is AP reporting. Quickly named a little-known vice president as caretaker and insisted the government was in control. Raisi was 63. He was a hardliner who formerly led Iran's judiciary and was viewed as a protege of Khamenei, the supreme leader. During Raisi's tenure, relations continued to deteriorate with the West as Iran reached uranium closer than ever to weapons-grade levels. We have talked about that on previous episodes of Working for Crusoe. 8 people died aboard the helicopter, which was made by Bell. And getting aviation parts in Iran is hard because of embargoes, and safety checks are kind of non-existent, even when, according to the AP reporting here, even when carrying the Iranian president, which is kind of a fascinating downstream consequence of sanctions, which are often thought to be, frankly, ineffective.
Okay, I'm not convinced of that. That is, I'm not convinced that the helicopter was poorly maintained because of sanctions against Iran. For example, we hear all the time that Iran is apparently a couple of months or so away from having enriched uranium to weapons grade, but they can't fix a helicopter. Sanctions apparently aren't stopping them from having a nuclear weapons
That's a
program.
great point.
All right. Also, it wasn't very long ago that Iran unleashed a barrage of drones and cruise missiles, hundreds of them, against Israel. Now, obviously, drones and cruise missiles don't carry people, right? So there's no, sort of safety parts that they have to have. But
they still fly.
Yeah, drones are not as sophisticated as helicopters. I would say, though, that cruise missiles are equally as sophisticated, if not more so. And so you're close to having weapons grade uranium. You've got cruise missiles, but you can't fix a helicopter. And I think the great irony here is actually the death of Iran's foreign minister, Hossein Amir Abdullahian, whom we've discussed here on Working for Crusoe in our previous episode when Israel retaliated for that barrage of air fire with a much smaller strike against the Iranian city of Isfahan, and various military facilities there. At which point, the foreign minister compared the weaponry that Israel had deployed to toys that Iranian children play with. So maybe if you weren't arming your children with military grade air power, you might have some parts for your helicopter. That's just, I'm just guessing. I could be wrong about that. But this whole thing about, for instance, one of the people who mentioned the sanctions as a reason for the helicopter crash was the Russian Foreign Minister Sergei
Right.
Lavrov,
Right.
right? And so I think that
It's
there's
an attempt to blame the West a bit.
yeah,
Right.
and mind you, kind of uncharacteristically, the Iranian regime did not foment any sort of anti-American conspiracy theory, saying that the West had somehow assassinated uh, uh, the president and the foreign minister by shooting down the helicopter or sabotaging it in some way, which would not be something that we would be surprised to see them do. But they didn't do something like that. The official explanation was the
Fog.
aircraft crashed in bad weather. Yeah, it was terrible weather and very mountainous terrain.
I actually saw one published report. I'm struggling to remember where it was, but it wasn't some like meme. It was in some newsletter I had that the Iranians actually had reached out to the United States for help following the crash, kind of quietly, and the United States was like, "What do you want us to do?" And they never got back. Kind of.
Right. No, I heard that
Yeah.
report also. I mean,
Yeah.
I don't know what they expect. I mean, there's
Right, like search and rescue in your foggy mountains is
but
probably not.
they found them within a day. I mean,
Right.
it's not like the U.S. has tons of resources in that immediate
Right.
vicinity that they can deploy. They do have some, but I don't know what they would have expected them to do.
Sure. But it is interesting, like, oh, our president's helicopter is missing. Suddenly, get the great Satan on the horn. Maybe they can help.
Who are you going to call?
Yeah, right. It's sad in a sense that, he's not democratically elected, but there is something almost slightly pathetic about Iran being like, we can't find a president. I guess we need to call the United States.
Yes, and this is not the first time that Iran has been made to look sort of incompetent in recent days, especially, right? The whole sort of, they launch hundreds of weapons, none of them get through.
Right.
Right.
Like 300, right?
Something like that.
Yeah.
Yes. And so, they failed to stop the children's toys that Israel launched against them.
Right.
So I think that, as we've discussed before, Iran is so used to projecting power by means of proxy forces that their own forces don't seem to work very well. I think we've also discussed in that same episode how when back in 2020, when Soleimani was killed by the United States, and the first thing that Iran did was shoot down a civilian aircraft by accident, right? Because they just sort of freaked out and accidentally killed a bunch of innocent people, right? And so their own sort of conventional military prowess would seem to be a little bit lacking. Hopefully, we won't have to anytime soon find out exactly how lacking it is, actually. We should be thankful not to really know.
Speaking of conventional military power, can we move on to our comparison of the Cold Wars, plural, and the
yes, please.
Interim between the world wars? So
certainly,
you obviously threw me a bone here because one of my favorite subjects is the First World War, because it's the great first artifact of history in the 20th century. And the 21st century is proving to be some sort of like absurdist one-man art play reenactment of the 20th century.
Yeah, some kind of weird reboot.
Yeah, weird and bad.
Yes.
And so I went digging around. There's a very good series on Netflix right now about the history of the Cold War and the post-Cold War and the rise of Putin leading to the current crisis with Ukraine.
Well, yes, and a couple of different journalists have come out with books just in recent weeks about the origins of our contemporary Cold War, which everybody seems to be convinced is where we're at.
And you know what? I'll accept that. I haven't found a great kind of foothold in any kind of counter argument that this isn't effectively a second Cold War. The difference being it's Russia and China rather than the United States and the Soviet Union.
Yes, I'm pretty comfortable with it also. But as we've discussed, there's so much trade that we do with China, and that's really the huge difference. And it may not end up making all that big a difference at all, but it's something to think about. And as we're making these comparisons, is that not everything is exactly the same.
You think about how ubiquitous the iPhone is, right?
Absolutely.
There's no Soviet technology that was in the pocket of every single American.
Certainly not. All right. Nothing like that.
Nothing like it. Um, I was, digging around on the old Wikipedia and I found a George Kennan quote from 1998. Okay, Kennan died in 2005 at 101.
Yes.
Kennan was like, he was a longtime diplomat, and I mean, he helped with the Marshall Plan, right? That's
Yes.
George Kennan, among other things. He described the U.S. Senate vote in 1998 to expand NATO to include Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic as, quote, the beginning of a new Cold War. That's the first kind of documentation of that term, the new Cold War, in this context, and predicted that, quote, the Russians will gradually react quite adversely and it will affect their policies. Of course, the term Cold War itself, do you know where we get this from?
No, please tell me.
It's the biggest duh ever. George Orwell used it. It's the first person
Oh,
to
I
use
didn't
it
realize that.
in a post World War II essay.
Huh.
Not
Doesn't
specifically
surprise me.
about U.S.-Soviet relations, but in the context of discussing Soviet totalitarianism. So anyway, yes. Do we need to define terms? The Cold War, end of the Second World
No, I
War?
don't think
Okay,
so.
okay.
I mean, I think everybody will
Everybody
know
knows
what we're
Soviet
talking
Union.
about.
Yeah, Soviet Union v. USA is the first Cold War. Russia, China v. United States in the West is the second Cold War. And Sam, your thesis, you what is it? Your hypothesis, your supposition, you're positing that much as the end of the First World War led to an inevitable Second World War.
Which I'm not so sure is true, by the way, but
no,
that's
and
what
we
people,
can.
yeah.
I'm inclined to believe that. You're saying that so thus ended, or such was the ending of the First Cold War, that this Second Cold War was, if not inevitable, then likely.
I would say that the conditions surrounding the end of the Cold War, and especially the years immediately following, uh, laid the groundwork for the Cold War that we're experiencing now.
Okay, so I did understand the assignment. So I just wrote down a couple of things about post-Cold War Russia that I thought were reminded me of post-World War I Germany, Weimar Germany. You've got hyperinflation. You've got degradation of the military. You've got an economic catastrophe that comes after a bad decade economically in the 90s in Russia. There's a crash in 1998 that hurt Russian GDP worse than the Great Depression.
Yes.
Hurt US GDP. So hyperinflation, degradation of the military, a decade of wobbly economics followed by a Great Depression-like event. That rings a lot of bells when thinking about interwar Germany.
And not just that, but
I was astonished about the 98 financial situation.
Yes, that was a big
I did
deal.
not realize it was Great Depression bad.
Oh, it was terrible. And
for Russia.
Yes, all of these things led to a generalized feeling of national humiliation,
right,
in post-Soviet Russia. For example, if we were to look at countries like what was then Czechoslovakia and quickly became the Czech Republic and Slovakia, or Poland or Hungary or any of these places, they were generally just very happy to be out from under the thumb of the Soviet Union. So whatever economic troubles they were having, which they did have, they at least felt that they were pursuing their own destiny finally, in many senses, for the first time in many, many years.
We've got problems, but there are problems.
Exactly. Right. But they weren't anywhere near as bad as what was going on in Russia. So if you were to ask those people in those smaller countries, how do you feel about the end of the Soviet Union? They say it's great. Right. But if you were to ask people in Russia, they would have said it's terrible. We liked it better before. And so I think it's difficult to underestimate how important that was. And in addition to everything you just mentioned, it was really the wholesale looting of the country that took place. This was the birth of the Russian oligarch, right? Where suddenly all these people were just taking tons of money out of the country. After the 1998 crash, the World Bank and the IMF put together a bailout package of some $22 billion for Russia. And in their after-action reporting, they figured that about 5 billion of that disappeared instantly. And to nobody knows exactly where. However, much of the sort of fire sale of former state assets took place with the underwriting of Western banks. And by that, I mainly mean British banks, because Great Britain at the time had by far the lightest financial regulatory regime of anywhere in the Western world. We will remember that the American financial system wasn't fully deregulated until 1998, actually by coincidence. But by that time, it was generally over. So American banks generally didn't participate in the looting process.
So what you mean is I'm a Russian oligarch slash gangster and I'm getting a loan from a British bank to buy a gas company or something. Is that what you're saying?
Some things like that. Yes, exactly. Right. And so now there's
a gas company that was previously held by the now dissolved Soviet state.
Exactly. Right. And so there's an old saying about banking where it's, if I owe the bank $1 million, yes, I'm in trouble. If I owe the bank $1 billion, the bank's in trouble. Right. Now we might repurpose that saying for the reasons of this discussion and say that if I launder $1 million through the bank, I'm corrupt. If I launder $1 billion through the bank is also corrupt because they have to know something's going on, right? Some Russian guy you've never heard of before, Anyway, all of these things had an enormous impact. Meanwhile, I think one of the great overlooked episodes of the beginning of the end of the Cold War was the massacre in Tiananmen Square in Beijing in 1989, in which hundreds, if not thousands, of people were gunned down in the street. This was in the summer, and then it was a terrible world-shaking event, or it seemed to be at the time. But then just a few months later, the Berlin Wall came down. However, in the interim, here in the United States, there was some debate about whether or not the United States should maintain what was then called most favored trading nation status with China, which was the prerogative of the president at that time, George H.W. Bush. And he didn't decide right away, and then the Berlin Wall fell. And suddenly, people weren't thinking about this so much. The whole narrative shifted very quickly to, well, we've won this Cold War. And so whatever happens in China isn't going to be top of mind anymore. And in fact, most favored nation trading status was extended the following year. Mm-hmm. There was a bill in Congress that actually did pass Congress that President Bush vetoed that tried to stop him from extending that trade status. In fact, that bill was authored by a then rather young and not well-known California member of the House of Representatives named Nancy Pelosi, then in her second term in the House of Representatives. And of course, as time went on, the trade status of China only improved to the point where they actually joined the World Trade Organization under the auspices of George W. Bush. But their trade status was made permanent under the presidency of Bill Clinton, who, by the way, also signed the legislation that deregulated the financial system.
Right.
But this, of course, helped extend the rising prosperity of China and their business ties with the West, which, and in 1989, were still only about a decade old and were a fraction of what they are today. And had their trade status been downgraded, or at least not upgraded, things might be very different today. We might not think of China as being the great competitor of the United States that we think of them as now.
Simply because they
Well,
wouldn't have had enough cash to build a big
they
navy.
wouldn't
And
have become quite as prosperous a
yeah,
nation. Now, on the other hand, we should, air legitimate opposing arguments here. Why should we stand in the way of people becoming more prosperous? It's much better. The standards of living in China are much higher now than, and shouldn't we welcome that? Uh, and so there's a debate that can be had here. That's all.
and you can also make the case that even if we don't agree with their system of government, even if they're expansionist, even if we don't like what they're doing kind of provocatively in the Strait of Taiwan or whatever, a prosperous country, unless there's a complete psychopath in charge, is probably less likely to fight an unnecessary war.
And something like that was the argument made by George H.W. Bush himself. I remember him saying,
as you know, Sam, I'm a leading neoliberal. I'm just kidding.
Yes, I remember him saying, we don't want to isolate China.
Sure.
We want to wrap them in the network of international institutions and thereby help them become a responsible member of the international community.
If you think about it, that makes a lot of sense at that time.
Okay, it does, but the fact is that people who were whispering in his ear at that time also included the business lobby, who really didn't want to see this go away.
Right.
And
so they're not making a good faith argument about human freedoms and the march of progress. They're seeing
they might have thought they were. Oh, well, the business
but they're
lobby
seeing a big market.
Yeah. And I think that had a great impact. And there was also a great sense of Western triumphalism, right? Where Bill Clinton himself, on his way out of office in 2000, that it was then that he upgraded the Chinese trade status to permanent most favored trading nation or something like that, but a step up from what it had been before. And he was asked about Chinese attempts to control the internet. And he famously said it would be like trying to nail Jello to the wall. Well, he was wrong. Okay, now we have what we think of as the Great Firewall of China. And China, in fact, does control internet traffic very draconianly inside of their own country. And there was a narrative afoot at the time that said that eventually economic freedoms in China will lead to a greater sense of political freedom in China. And I think this is just sort of chauvinistic. The fact is, that's how things played out in the West, where indeed, right, people enjoyed greater economic freedom before they enjoyed greater political freedom. But that doesn't mean it has to play out that same way everywhere. There's no reason the Western experience should have to be replicated by some sort of weird law of nature across every kind of society all over the world. And in fact, that hasn't happened. If anything, Xi Jinping today is a greater tyrant than any of his immediate predecessors. And so, in fact, depending on how things go here in November, our system could end up looking a bit more like theirs.
Right.
And in fact, there's some debate here as to whether or not the internet itself has been all that healthy for our democracy. And so it's not just that this narrative that came about after the Cold War of Western triumphalism was mistaken. It, in some ways, could prove to be almost diametrically wrong.
Right.
And this, I think, is the great danger. But I do believe that that period right after Tiananmen could have proved to be an inflection point if we'd made different decisions.
Again, I was just, thinking like undergraduate world history comparative essay. I just started to look at the things that I know about the end of the First World War. And the other thing was the degradation of the military, right? So Russia, after the dissolution of the Soviet Union, fights the first Chechen War in 1994.
Yes.
They have vast numerical superiority, and yet the war goes on for like a year and a half. The Russians sustain as many as 3 times as many killed in action as the Chechens, and they signed this treaty in 1997. that didn't even really resolve Chechen independence. It just ended the killing until the second Chechen war started like 4 years later.
That's right.
Actually, only about 2 years later. And
That's right.
And so you have this spike in economic inequality. You have this military humiliation. You have really fertile soil for just kind of grievance populism that, or I guess maybe not populism for Putin, but a grievance based politics. And that's certainly very similar to post First World War.
Oh, I'm pretty comfortable calling Putin a populist.
Yeah?
That doesn't
Okay.
bother me at all. But another thing, Putin
Because we would call National Socialism in Russia or in Germany after the First World War populist.
Certainly.
Yeah.
I think in many ways Putin was very fortunate because he took office, as we recall, in 2000, and he was not elected, by the way. Yeltsin
he was appointed.
resigned. Yeah. And so he never actually had to enter office by means of election.
And then he gets his war with maybe his false flag terrorist attack.
But then in 2001, the 9/11 attacks happened here in the United States. And as a result, oil prices, which had been very low for many years, suddenly skyrocketed. And in fact, many scholars believe that the sustained low oil prices of the 80s really helped bring the Soviets to the table in the Gorbachev years because they were just
it wasn't
suddenly,
Reagan defense spending only?
Well, I mean, there were many different factors, but when suddenly one of your main money makers is not making you that much money anymore,
right,
it makes a big difference, especially in such a terrible sort of economic system as Soviet communism.
That is something that I don't hear often mentioned, low price of oil in the 80s.
No, because because people want you to think it's all because of Reagan. And I'm not saying Reagan had no impact, right? But there's other things that also had an impact. But then 9/11 happens. Oil prices go through the roof. And suddenly, for the first time since the end of the Soviet Union, there's money pouring to Russia like you wouldn't believe. And only then did some of the oil wealth begin to trickle down to the rest of the population. And so there suddenly was a sense of widespread prosperity inside of Russia itself, not unlike when Hitler started building the Autobahn and lots of other public works and things like that. And suddenly everybody was working, right? And so Putin benefited enormously from 9/11 in ways that I think are underappreciated here in the West.
And he had been appointed president, so it's on his watch, however unelected, that prosperity arrives.
Yes.
And then he's in a position to win elections and consolidate power. And we're still doing this 25 years later.
That's right. And so, for instance, even here in the United States, presidents really don't have that much impact on what happens in the economy. They do have some, right? But they get the credit for it if it goes well, and they get the blame for it if it goes badly. And we shouldn't be surprised if the same thing happens in any other country.
The real question then is, does history view Obama as like Chamberlain, as an appeaser?
Well, look, I mean, I think some people certainly do.
I mean,
right? But
you and I we're both big supporters of Obama in real time. His handling of Ukraine in 2014 does not look as good now.
No, it certainly doesn't. And not to mention Syria at about that same time.
Right.
But we shouldn't fall in love with these comparative constructions.
Sorry,
right?
It's my nation. Just help me understand
but they're instructive up to a point.
Sure.
But we shouldn't just say, well, this is exactly like that, right? Because it's never going to be. For instance, that same significance of 9/11 plays out slightly differently in China. When 9/11 happened, it was right before Hu Jintao took power. And nobody knew exactly how things were going to go. But then
that was Deng Xiaoping to Hu Jintao, right?
No, it was Jiang Zemin was in between.
Okay.
But then the United States invaded Iraq. And this really was a big black eye for the United States internationally, right? And then 5 years later, the financial crisis happened. So two really enormous world events occur that made the United States just look terrible. And then the next president that China selected was Xi Jinping. Now we think of Xi Jinping as a sort of, totalitarian tyrant, and in some ways that's apt. But we should recall that unlike Vladimir Putin, for instance, Xi Jinping was elected the president by the Chinese Communist Party in the same way that both of his immediate predecessors were, right? He came to power just the same way Chinese presidents always do. But he was the first one to come in after the United States sustained these two big black eyes. And there are some people, and I have some sympathy for this point of view, who believe that it was then that the Chinese Communist Party said, okay, we're going to need to start taking the gloves off. This is our chance. They probably knew that their demographic profile going forward wasn't going to look so good. And keep in mind, back in 2012, when Xi took power, at that time, China's economy was still the envy of the world. They seemed to be going from strength to strength. And so I think it's very likely that the party said, we need a stronger guy. We need someone who's going to take it to the West now, because this is the last chance we're going to have. And in that sense, this analogy does begin to break down.
Yeah.
Right. And that's where the departure kind of occurs. And I think it's instructive to keep that in mind because, these metaphors, they're entertaining. They can help us understand things. But again, history does not repeat. People think it does. It doesn't.
Looking ahead to next week, some foreign minister, some official for some Baltic country said Putin's looking at some island that belongs to Sweden or something in the Baltic Sea. So
that could be true. I'm much more concerned about the election in South Africa, frankly.
That's right.
And
the UK is going to have an election. They just announced.
Yes, but that's not till July. South African elections are next week. And so for the first time since the end of apartheid, the African National Congress Party probably won't win an outright majority in parliament. So they'll have to form the first post-apartheid coalition government in South African history. And part of the reason for that is because in recent years, including just this year, a couple of different parties have split off from the ANC. So by the time we go to air next week, we'll probably have the results, but we probably won't know what the coalition government is going to look like. It'll be something to watch, certainly.
All right. In Los Angeles, he's Sam Park. In San Diego, I'm John Ramey. This has been Working for Crusoe. Have yourselves a great weekend.
Thanks, everybody.